All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest Urban Living webinar. Today, we are going to be talking about the living sector's wish list from the new government. My name's George Sell. I'm the editor of Urban Living News, and we are an online B2B platform for the living sectors. And we also organise events and award schemes. We have got a fantastic panel with us today to discuss the topic, and I'm just going to ask them to introduce themselves in turn, and we'll go from left to right as we see them on the screen. So first of all, Oliver, good morning to you.
Morning, George. Yeah, good to be here, and thanks for inviting me. So yeah, as it says on the tin there, I'm an associate director at Cavendish Consulting. We're a UK-wide company with 10 regional offices, working across all comms disciplines, but also primarily my work is around government relations and corporate communications. Been working at Cavendish for 5 years, and before that worked in planning communications, community consultation within the built environment as well. So yeah, before that was running election campaigns for the Conservative Party when they used to win slightly more than they currently do now. But there we go. But yeah, it's all interesting, and making sure we're getting up to speed with the Labour government we've got, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
All right, thanks, Ollie. Catherine, welcome to you.
Thanks very much. Morning, everybody. I'm Catherine Williams. I'm a real estate partner at Addleshaw Goddard, and I head up our living sector. And that's essentially, for us, anything with a bed in it. Also, a bit of a keen sort of podcast listener, really enjoying the sort of first 106 days I think we're on with the new government, and seeing what they're going to promise, and most of all, what they're going to deliver.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Jonathan, good morning to you.
Good morning to you, George, and good morning to everyone tuning in today. Jonathon Ivory, Chief Investment Officer at Package Living. We are a build-to-rent investor, developer, and operator, variously developing somewhere in the magnitude of 5,500 homes, specifically in the multifamily, single-family, and more recently the co-living sectors.
Thank you, Jonathan. And lastly, Kelly, good morning to you.
Good morning. Kelly Bream, COO, Bidwells. We are a multi-disciplined property advisory, specialising in everything from cradle to grave. And we've got a specialist operational living team. My background is in development and third-party build-to-rent operating platforms.
All right, thank you very much. So the webinar is going to last an hour. We're going to have around 45 minutes of Q&A with the panelists. We'd love you to submit your questions. You can use either the chat or the Q&A function in Zoom. So we'll answer audience questions either as and when, if we're on the topic, or we'll save some time at the end of the session. We will send a link to a recording of the session by email to everybody who's registered. And when we get to the end of the hour, we're going to leave the session open for a couple of minutes so you can take some notes from all the information that's in the chat. So just had a look around to see what's been making the headlines in terms of the sector and the new government. As Catherine said, they've been in power just over 100 days now. There are an awful lot of pictures of Keir Starmer in high vis and with hard hats, if you do enough searching. And they have been talking the talk. They've been making some bold claims, particularly the target of 1.5 million new homes during the course of the Parliament. And some of the other issues we're going to get on to talk about are potential rent reforms, which have just been backed by Unison, the biggest trade union in the country. Leasehold reform, you can see on the story in the middle there, is something that we'll move on to as well. And if we go on to the next slide. But yeah, I like this picture of the mayor and the prime minister standing there like a couple of mannequins in the middle of a park. I'm not quite sure what they're doing there. The message there: the government doesn't have plans to give the London mayor specific rent control powers. We have seen rent controls in Scotland, and we'll talk about what's happened there and what the implications might be elsewhere if they are introduced here. So let's get stuck in. We've got a lot to get through today. So I want to start by asking, I'll start with you, Jonathan. Do you think the government is giving enough emphasis to encouraging the development of rental homes as part of this much publicised 1.5 million unit target?
In a word, no. Unless I've missed it, I've not heard any reference to rental housing specifically. The narrative seems to be building more houses, which is great. That's admirable. But it seems there doesn't seem to be any discussion of how the homes are going to be paid for. In and of itself, house building or building more houses doesn't address the affordability issue, at least not in the short or medium term. So I guess my worry is that my concern is that it's a precursor to another demand side stimulus, aka help to buy, or some iteration of that, which ironically has the effect of pushing home ownership further out of reach of middle income earners. So we as representatives of the living community, would all advocate for the creation of more rental housing, if not as a kind of a permanent tenure of choice, but at least as a kind of a stepping stone to home ownership. And it just seems that that's lost in the discussion of kind of getting diggers on site and spades in the ground. So in answer to your question, I haven't heard it. That doesn't mean it's not part of the it's not in their wheelhouse, but it's not being discussed, and therefore I think it's probably it's not front and center of the priorities as usual.
Yeah, Catherine, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's a real lack of understanding about what build to rent specifically is, both single family and multifamily. I think somebody did a survey last year, and only 11% of MPs would have supported a build to rent product in their constituency, which is just bizarre, really. So I wonder, is it just down to all of us to try to bring them up to speed, frankly, and make them realise that this is a choice for many people now. Home ownership is not the holy grail for young people anymore.
Catherine, if I might jump in there, because you've kindly referenced our build to rent report that we did last summer. So that was ours. We surveyed 115 MPs across the House, and build to rent came out as a priority. So in the top 3 tenures of just 11% of MPs. One thing I would say is there's been a sea change in Parliament now. So of those 115, it was obviously an anonymous survey, so we don't actually know who responded. So we could see kind of half or less still remaining in Parliament, and obviously the kind of makeup of Parliament is very different now. There is a massive increase in local councillors, former local councillors who have moved away from their council posts and up onto the green benches in Parliament. Georgia Gould, Jess Toll, Lloyd Hatton, Rachel Blake, Dan Tomlinson, to name but a few, on the Labour benches. So I think that will help in terms of the, Jonathan, in terms of your point and your concern around kind of the importance of rented homes and the need for them. I suppose I would just say that there's some positivity around the government. You had Matt Pennycook recently on LBC being questioned by Nick Ferrari, and he did kind of name check the fact that the Labour government wants to see more institutional landlords who do take care of their customers and have that ability to do so, and that set up to do so that most in the traditional PRS don't necessarily have, because they might have 2 or 3 homes and be a landlord in of themselves rather than an institutional landlord. So I would say that, and the other point I'd say is the kind of detail around the NPPF reforms that were consulted on recently as well, which obviously look to build in rental need into local plans, as well as social housing and private sale. So I think there are bits and pieces starting to trickle through, but Jonathan, to your point, it's not going to be all at once and everything you want to see at the pace that you will need to see as well. So completely appreciate that point, but I think there is a bit more understanding than there was in the previous government, which is a good start and something to build on.
Oliver, sticking with you for a minute, we've had a question in from the audience from Mike Sheehan at Mosaic, and he says, should local authorities compel house builders to deliver build to rent on large sites via Section 106 agreements in the same way that they do affordable housing? Is this likely to be part of the changes to the NPPF, or will it not go that far?
I can't see the NPPF name checking build to rent that much and in that positive light, but I can see it pushing the need for rental accommodation up the agenda, albeit it is always going to play third fiddle to private sale homes in the 1.5 million new homes. Obviously, let's not forget that Keir had his own target there of 70% home ownership, particularly among young people. That hasn't cropped back up, but before the election, that was the kind of the second clause to that 1.5 million new homes was 1.5 with a 70% home ownership focus on young people. So that's interesting, and particularly interesting with the news around Rachel Reeves potentially removing the discount on stamp duty in the budget as well, and we'll see what happens on the 30th of October. But I don't think they'll go that far. But what I do see is a lot more local authorities becoming a lot more kind of comfortable with build to rent as it becomes a bigger product. It's already grown massively, as we know, and now the single family housing side of the product is growing as well. So I think the more it grows, the more local authorities have those planning applications to review, have those planning applications built out, and see the kind of communities that the BTR sector is building, whether they be multi-family communities in more urban settings, or whether they be single family in more suburban and rural settings. And the kind of local authorities see the benefits of those long-term customer-focused products coming into their communities. I think the better things will be. But yeah, I can't see it being overly detailed at this stage, but there's a lot of detail to work through.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. Kelly, coming to you now. Let's stick with planning for a minute. But if you had a magic wand and you could really influence what planning reforms would be coming through, what would you ask for in order for the living sector to flourish and reach its potential?
That feels like a big wish sitting on my shoulder here. I mean, the reality and probably most obvious is simplicity. I'd suggest that planning probably needs a greater emphasis on the importance of multi-tenure housing. And I get the point, that it has been alluded to in the NPPF that this could be strengthened further. And I think that's positive signs. I think, Catherine, back to your point, education of the sector, many local planning authorities need to better understand the models and the options so that they can develop their own policies that really encourages a range of tenures within their authority that they need. I think there's policy that does exist, but typically it's those that's coming through in towns that have already got emerging BTR coming through. So how do we encourage single family in those sort of lower density, less urban areas? I think local authorities just need to provide clearer, up-to-date plans, to maybe help developers understand what is feasible. It's avoid all these costly delays and rejections. And probably to that end, it's a top-down approach from national government that I think really needs to feed into the regions and local areas to better set out range of tenure options, benefits. I know there's a lot that's happening in the sector, and we're doing a lot more, but I think it still makes about 5% roughly of actually housing stock in the UK. We did a research paper that also shows that in the time it takes non-BTR sectors to build one home, the build to rent sector actually builds nearly 6. And I think this is really important data to help local authorities understand the benefits, particularly with such an ambitious housing target.
And we've concentrated mainly on build to rent now, but I'd like to think that later living should also be on the agenda and should also be something that should have targets, because that's even more dramatically undersupplied than other asset classes. Co-living is something that planners really seem to have a problem understanding at the moment, and we've seen some pretty outlandish comments about it from certain councillors. So do you think the planning system needs to have more detailed guidance about these specific asset classes built into it.
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to the better understanding of all the different models and how they really benefit different people at different stages of their life. And the reality is, if we want economic growth, we need better social mobility. And in order to deliver better social mobility, we need different housing that is able to address people at different stages of their career. And I'm also recognizing that there isn't an aspiration for everybody to own their own home. This is no longer the gold standard that we're all sort of, vying for. And there is a shift demographically there, which policy needs to reflect. So absolutely better understanding of all of the models and a consideration of all of them, particularly on big regen projects.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Catherine, let's move on to rent controls. We're likely to see them in England, and can you tell us about what's happening?
Well, I do hope not, because doing so would be sort of the definition of insanity, given what we've seen in Scotland. There is a little bit of a concern that the Renters' Rights Bill in its current format does actually bring in some element of rent control. So having just let your property on the open market to a tenant who is willing to pay that price, the fact that you could challenge it in the courts would be akin to a rent control. So we don't really love that. I'm sure the institutional investors don't love that. But who knows what will happen. Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner have both suggested that it's not in their sights. Angela Rayner actually admitted that it would stifle supply, and obviously supply is the big thing right now. We don't want to encourage demand. We want to increase supply. But I've still got a niggling worry that Sadiq Khan will want to bring it in London. I don't know what the other panellists think. He's said it before. And Rachel Reeves did say she could see it coming in on a geographical basis. So that is hanging over us a little bit.
Interesting. Jonathan, the Scotland example, has that deterred you from any activity that you might have planned up there?
I'm sorry to say it has. Yeah, we would love to invest in Scotland, but the mood music or the legislative background is just wholly inappropriate. I can't think of an example globally of where rent control has been introduced and it's produced the desired effect. The opposite, right? It just kind of inflates rents. It leads to lack of investment and generally speaking, lack of capex and maintenance in properties. So it has the opposite of its intended effect. It's economically illiterate, and yet it never fails to surprise me that despite all of that groundswell of evidence to point to the fact that it fails in its objectives, politicians, often of the left, reach for it as a kind of a quick, expedient political win. So it wouldn't surprise me if it kind of rears its ugly head again, whether that's Sadiq or whoever it might be, because it just continues to do so. History has taught us that. But fortunately, it doesn't appear. There's no evidence to suggest that this administration is thinking of bringing it in. So I hope that they I hope that they stick to that.
Thanks, Jonathan. Ollie, what's your take on that? Do you think London is the most likely place for potential rent control, and how likely do you think it is?
I suppose zooming out from London a bit, but devolution is probably the point we're talking about here. And we know that devolution is on the cards. We now have a Council of Nations and Regions led by Ms. Sue Gray now, and we're obviously kind of seeing what the kind of terms of reference and the scope of work that council will undertake is going to be. It's still a bit blurry, but I think devolution is the key. That's going to start with a lot of items around transport and skills and education, but whether that does move into housing and how that moves into housing, whether that be planning, potential new towns, and metro mayors, combined authorities having a bit of a say over where those new towns go. Obviously, they're not going to come forward very quickly, but also on rents. I don't think it's going to happen, but it's not to say it's off the cards. We know there's a white paper coming down the track on the English devolution bill. there'll be a consultation attached to that, I'm sure. So it's at that point where the sector absolutely needs to be banging the drum for not just the impact of bringing in rent controls, but the kind of lost opportunity in terms of the supply side piece of how that would damage pipelines of anyone looking to build rental homes across the country as well. So I think that's the kind of call I would make on the sector is, you know, make sure that you are submitting to the call for evidence now that's in the Public Bill Committee for the Renters' Rights Bill, and also make sure that, you know, if there is any consultation around devolution and handing down powers around rent controls to metro mayors or county combined authorities, that they are really clear. And I think just attached to that as a final point, the way to do that is through opening up your assets to these politicians, get them round your sites, get them to see the communities you're creating, and get them to see the kind of product that you are producing in their areas. Because it's all very well and good to see something on paper and potentially look at it through a home views platform or Zoopla or whatever it might be, but actually getting politicians round these places so that they can see for themselves and maybe meet some of the residents will be absolutely key in changing perceptions positively or demystifying any preconceptions that politicians may have around the products that the renters sector, particularly the BTR and SFH sectors, are building at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. We've already mentioned that Starmer has still got this kind of holy grail of home ownership, despite Kelly saying that it's not as important as it used to be to certain sectors of the population. I guess the logical extension of that would be to reintroduce Help to Buy or something similar. Jonathan, do you think that's on the cards, and what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I truly hope not. I touched on it in my kind of opening piece. Yeah. You know, the narrative that certainly the previous administration would have us all believe is that you know, Help to Buy increased the number of people accessing the housing market that perhaps otherwise might, you know, not have done so. There's fairly good evidence now to suggest that in reality, all that Help to Buy did was inflate house prices. You know, it made home ownership less affordable as a consequence. It certainly enriched house builders and their stockholders, and I'm not sure that it did anything more than maybe marginally increase the actual output of houses. So a bit like rent control, it hasn't really had the intended consequence. You know, demand side stimulus is useless unless it has something at the kind of the bottom up. So, you know, supply side. He's onto the right thing by talking about house building, yes. And some of the things that they're talking about are intriguing. You know, the kind of the grey belt, as it's called. I think I read that a report yesterday had opened up, identified things like 8,000 sites in the UK that might be appropriate for that. So house building, yes, but it needs to come with a solution for how people are going to own those homes. So there's nothing wrong with home ownership. You know, it's very aspirational. It's why people don't talk about renting, because it's not aspirational, as appropriate it might be for someone's circumstances. Everyone wants to own a home. I believe that. You know, and I've been drinking the build to rent Kool-Aid for well over a decade now. And that's all very well and good, but if you can't buy it without, you know, the government underwriting your mortgage, then there's something wrong with that business model. The price of that house is too high. You know, why is that? And so I think build to rent, it's not the panacea for the housing solution, far from it, but it's part of the question, it's part of the solution, it's part of the answer. You know, if the average house price is what, 9-10 times, you know, median earnings now, and it would take, you know, a decade plus, depending on, you know, where you are in the country, to kind of save for a deposit at historically still quite elevated rates of interest. Home ownership is unaffordable to the majority of people. So if you can't buy, you have to rent. And you can either rent from a, you know, social housing provider or an institution. And so the government, I believe it's incumbent on them to do everything they can do to assist institutions in their kind of, objective of building more homes for more build-to-rent homes, whilst we as a society, and this would take multiple administrations to solve for the delta between house prices and average earnings. We need, significant wage inflation. I'm not advocating for a crash in house prices because that would just kind of torpedo the economy. But over time, wage inflation coupled with, unlocking land for development and the supply of more housing, in addition to other tenures, build to rent being one of them, it's got to be part of the answer. So I'm not in favour of Help to Buy on its own or indeed at all. And I do worry that it's a quick off the shelf fix, which sounds good politically. It's a cheap sugar high, it's a quick dopamine hit, but actually it fails to address the underlying issues.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. Oliver, do you think the government will be reaching for the sugar bowl, or will they manage to resist the temptation?
I think for now, and nothing's ever off the table in politics, but and it does depend on where they are politically after October the 30th. But I don't see them bringing it back. I think this government does understand that Help to Buy did inflate house prices, which is why obviously there has been this focus on getting rid of the red tape. We've seen in the investment summit and the industrial strategy green paper this week, that kind of, if there is regulation that is blocking development, whether it be on the industrial infrastructure or even housing, let us know and we will look at it, is the kind of call from Kia. So I do think that they'll focus on that first, because they are already late on it. We've already seen the reports coming out saying, that target of 1.5 million is unachievable, and we all know how long things take in the planning system. And Kelly's already alluded to it in terms of the kind of LPA officer teams under resourcing, and the kind of skills that they need now, which aren't perhaps up to as the scratch that they may be, and part of that is also around the number of LPA officers as well across the country. We've had a good little drop in the ocean of 300 new planning officers as a commitment, still less than one per local authority across the country. So brilliant, absolutely great start, but it's going to have to be the first drop of many in the ocean rather than the only drop in the ocean, as it were. But I can't see Help to Buy coming in at this stage.
Thanks, Ollie. Catherine, tell us a bit about the forthcoming reforms to freeholding and what the implications are.
Do you really want to know? That's the problem. I'm quite worried about the leasehold and common hold bill that's been trailed. There's two problems with it, and I think this stems back to a problem that numerous governments have with this housing blame game. So it's pitting landlords against tenants. Developers are bad. They have to realise that they're not going to build their 1.5 million homes without institutional investors, the landlords, and without developers building. So if we have that as the backdrop, the two things that they want to change is they want to do something with ground rents, query what that will be, but it would range from complete abolition, which would be a real shock to the system, or capping ground rents to various levels. Both of those will cause pension funds irreparable harm. It shifts property from one class of people to another. That is going to invite judicial review left, right and centre. And in fact, judicial reviews are already underway. So that's a big worry of mine. And then the second element of it is abolition of leasehold and bringing in common hold. We've actually had a statute on the books for over 20 years, which would have allowed common hold to be used if it was fit for purpose, and it hasn't been. And I know they've acknowledged that it will need change, but there are more textbooks that have been written about common hold than current common hold developments. I think the Law Commission counted up 23 developments in the country. It just goes to show you it's not going to work here without a real effort. And I think, speaking as a lawyer, I mean, you all tease us to say that we love it when there's new legislation because we can charge you to advise on it. We're all quite terrified of this change because the leasehold system, obviously it has some problems, don't get me wrong, but it works. And I would much prefer that we tweaked the existing system that we've got and make sure that we can deliver these homes rather than, throw baby out with the bathwater and try to instigate a whole new way of owning land. So, yeah, I'm worried about it.
Thanks, Catherine. Anybody else want to chip in on that before we move on?
I think probably only just to say the additional pressure that it puts on a property management services in an environment where they're probably already underutilized, underskilled, under-resourced, and perhaps in some elements not sort of, performing. How do we sort of deal with that? And I don't think the answer is handing it to, a group of individuals that really don't have the skill sets to deliver. So a whole load of operational problems there, I think.
Yeah. Kelly, sticking with you for a minute, are you seeing ESG or sustainability regulations affecting delivery of living sector assets?
This is probably going to be maybe a slightly controversial answer, or I'm going to sit on the fence, because I think there's a sort of yes and no answer to this. Short answer is no, insofar as when you're looking at the question around, is it affecting significant delivery? And I think the answer there is no, because there's been a bit of a policy vacuum since the sort of red tape challenge back in 2011. And so I think that abolishment of net zero homes, that's lasted right up until building regs in 23. So I don't think there has been a direct impact in that sense. However, we do recognise, that there are challenges in accessing finance and some build cost implications that ESG and sustainability has. It does often necessitate the use of greener materials, more energy efficient systems, environmentally friendly construction methods. And yes, that does increase the original development costs. However, these should be offset by more affordable running costs, which should benefit the living sector. So actually that should be a positive that we should be seeing. I think there are, with green financing, there's many investors and lenders that are prioritising projects with strong ESG credentials. And we know that there are some perhaps smaller developers that can't meet this sort of threshold, this criteria. And therefore it's more difficult, more expensive to access finance, and particularly sustainability linked loans, which are becoming more popular. So yes, I think, there are some issues in that front. And I guess the other point is we know on the horizon is future homes and building standards. And there is the anticipated require all new homes in 25 as it's 75 to 80%-ish less carbon emissions in sort of those new homes. But there is still uncertainty around the detail of this. And if there's one thing that holds back the market, it's uncertainty. So I think the sooner that we can, the industry can prepare for whatever future homes or building standards looks like, then, the quicker we can get our heads around delivery, both on cost and scale. So sorry, that was a bit of an on the fence response.
Thanks, Kelly. Ollie, to your knowledge, are there any other likely ESG net zero related legislation coming through, concerning the built environment? We know about the future home standard and we've got an idea what we're going to get there, but is there anything else coming down the track?
At the moment, we can't see that. We can't see anything, but obviously minimum energy efficiency standards are going to be key, and they're going to be, they're going to be something that the sector has to be across. Obviously regarding things like nutrient neutrality and SPAs, that those kind of items in more rural and suburban areas where new developments are coming forward as well, they're going to continue to be a challenge. And I think what will be really quite worthwhile will be the sector not just keeping across what's in the NPPF reforms, but also what the energy security and net zero department are doing as well as obviously Department for Business and Trade on the industrial strategy side, and anything that's in national planning infrastructure pieces that obviously impact that. So yeah, for the moment, I can't see anything new coming forward, but there is a lot of policy and a lot of rhetoric already in the mix. And to Kelly's point, the detail of a lot of that policy and rhetoric and narrative is still to be ironed out. So yeah, there's lots of stuff for the government to be working on at the moment.
Yeah, excellent. Obviously, the key to the living sector reaching its full potential is increased institutional investment. These are the guys who are going to drive the growth. So, Jonathon, what does the investment community need to see from the government to ramp up its level of activity in the living sector?
Well, I mean, I'd like to see things like the recent overhaul of multiple dwellings relief repealed, rolled back. I think that was unhelpful, to say the least. We talked earlier about putting build to rent in the 106. I'm a big fan of that. The industry has wrestled for a long time about whether it wants a use class or not, and I'm not sure that argument's ever really been resolved. I think a neat solution would be to embed build to rent into the Section 106, so that it's treated the same way as affordable housing of various guises, and that just kind of removes the debate or the ability for the developer to view build to rent through the lens of, it's optional. Maybe they do it, maybe they don't. If it's a requirement, then that would definitely encourage a lot more investment into the sector. So I'd be pro that. People are talking a lot about renovating existing buildings as a means to reducing carbon footprints, and there's a huge amount of impact funds that have sprung up like mushrooms to kind of buy offices and renovate those, as opposed to kind of knocking them down and building new buildings. So some kind of green tax break where you remove the VAT on renovations, I think would be helpful for that business plan. Speaking personally, we buy a lot of homes from house builders, aka single family housing. One of our limitations is because we forward fund these house builders, we look through to the balance sheet and the covenant strength of these house builders, because we're asking them to guarantee the product, the program and the build and the specification, because we want a turnkey product. We're not necessarily in the risk business. And that limits us to dealing with, kind of generally speaking, large PLCs or large privates that have big balance sheets that can kind of stand behind those guarantees. So anything that the government, Homes England, whichever body it might be, that could, say, stand behind guarantee underwrite SME house builders who are perfectly capable of doing those kind of deals, would open up more investment into that sector. I'd love to see that happen. And frankly, if the government isn't prepared, doesn't have the wherewithal to do any of those kind of things, just stay out of the way. Do no harm. Don't intervene and pervert the market, whether it's help to buy or rent control. Just let us get on with it. Create an environment in which interest rates can continue to fall or normalize. That alone is the kind of the most meaningful any government administration can do.
I guess by including build to rent in the Section 106, you're also preventing the scenario where perhaps if we do have a lot of interest rate cuts, mortgages become much more affordable and private sales tick up. The house builders might be less inclined then to get involved in build to rent at scale, and they might want to devote a much higher proportion of their output to the private sale market. So a 106 could prevent us from ending up in that scenario.
Oh, you spotted my cunning plan, did you? That's I hadn't thought of that. That would be very helpful.
I mean, do you think that's something that house builders might, after all, that would simply be reverting to their sort of core business model? Do you think there's a danger of that happening if the economy goes that way?
I'm going to say no, because I have a dog in this fight, but I believe it. Doesn't mean it's not true. I think there are enough house builders with the word partnerships in their title or in their DNA of their business plans now, who have done enough of these deals to realize the benefits of essentially being wholesalers to groups like us, where I think they will continue to value that as an additional output, a means of increasing production and rates of delivery. So I don't see interest rates falling or help to buy as being the end of the single family housing sector. But it will slow it down, or it will preclude some investors, maybe those with a more expensive cost of capital, etc., from accessing that product. So yeah, by embedding it into the 106, that would be another way of continuing to see for us to kind of continue to see the growth of the sector, which, as I say, I think it has a viable place alongside home ownership and the various other tenures that we kind of know and love.
Jonathan, I have to admit, I didn't really keep up with a lot of what was discussed at this investment conference earlier this week, but was there much talk about the built environment there and the housing market, or was it more about kind of infrastructure stuff? Ollie, could you maybe give us a quick snapshot?
Yeah, of course. A lot of it was around finance and kind of effectively giving a platform for the government to say that it's open for business to the world and to global kind of investors from abroad. There was, however, within, if you read the kind of Invest 2035 industrial strategy document, there's still a lot of detail. They're looking for kind of high growth subsectors, and they're looking for those subsectors to kind of bring themselves forward rather than identifying them necessarily and saying, are these right, or are we missing any? They're almost asking everyone to kind of pitch their wares, as it were, in terms of how much they can invest and how much they can help the government on their growth mission for themselves. But there is a point around the built environment, specifically around housing, that the government do understand that you can't just bring in massive swathes of investment and not provide housing around potential new jobs, around potential new CRE developments, or whatever you might be building. You need to bring housing along with it. So there is that kind of more joined up approach that the government is looking at, and it's obviously spoken about strategic planning in its first 106 days, which is good. We're obviously going to be greeted with spatial development strategies akin to the London Plan, but every single combined authority, whether they have a mayor or not, will need to produce one in time alongside a local growth plan, which will be the skills and the investment and the jobs side of the kind of coin there. So I think that the government are starting to join the dots a lot more than we've seen perhaps in the past. Things feel a little less siloed across Whitehall, which is good to see. But I think, again, as I've said before, and I'm a little bit of a broken record at the moment, there's a lot of great narrative coming out of the government. There's a lot of kind of good mood music and positive signs, but it is about government delivering. And, you know, they are going to have a bit of a tricky time on the 30th of October. So making sure that they are seen to be delivering where they can be on policy. And to Jonathan's point, they are pushing the right levers and pulling the right levers and not tinkering where they shouldn't be, and where investment will be detracted from, then that will be a good focus for them to keep. But yeah.
Thanks, Ollie. Under the last government, we saw the implementation of the older people's housing task force. Obviously, the later living sector is probably got the biggest imbalance in terms of supply and demand. Catherine, has this task force anything of note? And if it has, is it a model that could be rolled out to other?
Yeah, and sadly, this was a Conservative task force, and so it hasn't actually been allowed to announce its findings, which is a real shame, because I've been at a number of events where Julianne Mayer was talking about the work of the task force, and it sounded great. We got some indicative outputs as an interim report. I think it was at the back end of 23, which was talking about very sensible things, outlawing hidden event fees, hidden being the operative word. I think everybody in the sector would like to see a little bit of clarity about that, because really the operators are very, very careful to explain their model very carefully, and it's a brilliant model that helps a lot of people when they want to move out of their homes and into somewhere which is a bit more suitable for their aging in place. They also came up with the idea that we should perhaps have a use class. It's super confusing in that world between C2 and C3, and the impact of affordable housing payments, and the clarity there would be helpful too. So it's a shame that they haven't been able to come out and tell us what their outputs were. Hopefully someone will just leak it anyway. And I do think the idea was a good one, because the people that were on that task force were absolute experts in their area, and they had the best of intentions for the residents. And that's all anyone in the living sector wants, isn't it? To make, make great homes for people, but also hopefully make some money at every point in that sort of ecosystem. So yeah, hopefully they will appreciate in the new government that this is a good idea, and maybe do the same for some of the nascent sectors, thinking about co-living. Education for single family BTR and co-living, I think, would really help with this 5-year plan to have 1.5 million new homes.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Okay, we are getting towards the end of the hour now. If you have any questions in the audience, please do submit them while you still have time. What I'd like to do now is to go round to each of you in turn and ask you what you think is the single most important thing the government should do in the next year to stimulate growth in the living sector, investment and delivery. Kelly, could I start with you, please?
Single's quite hard.
You can have more than one. You can have two. You won't have two.
I mean, planning reform probably seems the most obvious, but I think it's planning reform that is a policy that understands that in order to accelerate housing supply, we really need a policy around whether that's tri-tenure, but how do we include, the living sector? But it's also really important that that policy is linked to high growth locations economically, and delivering the infrastructure to actually be able to deliver the housing. It really is all intrinsically linked. And so there's almost no point having a conversation about housing over here, but not talking about how we're going to deliver jobs in that location and infrastructure in that location. So I think it's a planning reform that is joining up all of those departments and conversations more cohesively. Okay.
And do you want a second go?
Was that the wrong answer?
No, not at all. No. You said it's hard to narrow it down to one thing, so I'm being generous.
Oh, thank you. Yes, my second go with, could we just unlock a few more brownfield and public sector land for development would probably be my second go.
Thanks, Kelly. Ollie, how about you?
I've said it before. I think it's local planning authority officer teams. If I'm honest, I know how under-resourced they are, both in terms of manpower, but also in terms of skills and tools they have at their disposal. Like I say, the government have made that good drop in the ocean, but a lot more needs to come through. I think that would really help get those planning applications quicker. You'd have more skilled planning officers, less overworked, and able to kind of actually look at those kind of more strategic points that Kelly was talking about around kind of joining the whole piece of housing, jobs, employment, community all up together, because they're not just kind of under-resourced and therefore trying to kind of work on what they've got in front of them. So yeah, for me, it's local planning authorities and their resources and manpower would be useful.
I wonder if there's any data available about staff retention in planning departments, because it must be an incredibly stressful, pressured job, because as you say, there simply aren't enough people there to get the job done, and the pressure is coming from all angles. So it'd be interesting to see that. But yeah, that's definitely a good point. Thank you. Jonathan, how about you?
Interest rates. I know the government doesn't control interest rates, but it does have an effect or influence on the environment in which the Bank of England operates, and its scope or ability to lower interest rates is in part driven by, yes, macro factors, but also domestic factors, which are controlled by the government. So, never was there a more important day than 30th of October and this forthcoming budget. And so, if that is not pro-business, pro-growth, then I think we could have prolonged challenges in this country. So, for context, the reason for that is, without meaning to state the obvious, if interest rates, UK residential is a low-yielding asset class, historically speaking, and if rates are, and if it's yielding less than the risk-free rate, then there's no reason to invest, right? So that rate inversion needs to rebalance. We need rates to come down, so there's a meaningful spread between where rates end up sitting and where yields are currently or will go in the future. So yeah, anything that the government can do to foster that back backdrop, that environment to allow rates to come down to a more acceptable level is what will fundamentally unlock further investment in this sector.
Interest rates obviously have a direct correlation with the cost of development finance. Jonathan, do you get the impression that there are a lot of projects on hold and developers waiting to press the button if we have maybe one more cut, two more cuts, or do you think they're becoming reconciled that we're not going to go back to the interest rates that we had a couple of years ago, and
they're not going to zero, neither should they, but they can settle at a more historical range that is more conducive for that which I just mentioned. So you need a positive spread between where rates are and where the yield is on residential. And yes, rates falling, cost of finance falling a little bit will definitely be helpful in offsetting some of the kind of the challenge we've had in kind of build cost inflation and outward movement in yield. So these things don't operate in isolation, and the nexus of all of it is the kind of the risk-free rate and UK interest rates. So that kind of coming down a little bit will unlock a lot of what's kind of backing up in the system now, which is, to your point, just a lot of people sitting on their hands waiting for rosier times.
Was the cost of development finance the biggest element of build cost inflation, or was it materials prices or labour prices, or the three?
Well, it's the as I say, nothing is in isolation. They all kind of work together to create the kind of that output or standoff. But build cost inflation has definitely been a significant challenge. That which cost, and I'm talking about, let's say, multifamily now, that which cost meaningfully sub 200 quid a foot a few years ago is now well over £200 a foot. And whilst we've had rental inflation, very high rates of rental inflation, certainly kind of coming out of COVID, it isn't enough to kind of offset the outward movement in yield and the costs related to build cost inflation that we've had. So yeah, we just need to kind of bring those rates down, and then other things will start to settle in accordance with it.
Thanks, Jonathan. Okay, Catherine, you've got the last word.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think the government really needs to tread very carefully with its legislation to avoid unintended consequences. So whilst we all agree the Building Safety Act was absolutely necessary, the process is stopping delivery of new homes. So we need to make sure that that is not stifling development. We've got 100,000 homes stuck because of nutrient neutrality. So when the market says to the government, clause X in the bill is really going to discourage investment, listen to that. And not to be on one side of the other of a debate, but not to legislate in a way that will stifle supply.
Okay, and Catherine, do you get the sense from your clients that the budget and the interest rate are crucial factors in unlocking significant activity uptick in the next year or so?
Well, I'm going to be the voice of optimism. I don't think anyone's stopping doing things because of the budget. I think people are worried about the budget, quite rightly, because feels like it's gone on forever, doesn't it? But no, activities are high. So I think clients were excited by the changes that the new government said that they would bring in, albeit a bit disappointed with some of the implementation in the early days. I think people want to get on and build homes. So they want to deliver on that 1.5 million and are doing everything they can to do so. But so that's why being careful is it could really upset the apple cart to do silly things, both with legislation and in the budget.
Yeah, okay. We have still got a minute left, so I'm just going to throw a curveball at you now, which I didn't say earlier, but what would be your best guess of the figure that we'll actually arrive at during the course of this parliament? The target's 1.5 million. What do you think is a realistic number that will be achieved? I know it's a bit mean doing this, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Kelly, what do you think?
Punchy. I think based on historic data, we'll be lucky to hit half.
Yeah. Okay. Ollie?
I don't know, if I'm honest. I think it will depend on how quickly the government can get this NPPF reform through. I think it would depend on what policy they they want to pursue thereafter, whether it is kind of bringing forward the leasehold common hold draft bill relatively quickly, or whether it is kind of devolving power through the English devolution bill more quickly. So I think it's in the government's gift to create the environment whereby it can bring forward as many homes from as many different sectors, be it housing associations, council almos, and the private sector as possible. But I think, you know, the government's made some good strides at the start. More to do, but I couldn't give you a figure.
Jonathan.
Sorry, I was on mute there. My guess is it will be marginally above the most recent run rate. What was that? Sort of 150, kind of getting on for 200,000, but less than the kind of the fabled 300,000 a year. I mean, 1.5, great number to say, but hard to see how it gets done. I think planning would need to be just fundamentally, like radically reformed, and I'm not seeing that.
And finally, Catherine.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Kelly. I think it'll be half the number, because they can't actually deliver it. They're expecting other parties in the ecosystem to deliver, and you have to create a benign environment for that. So I think they've set themselves up to fail, sadly, although it's a great idea, and I hope we do.
Great stuff. Okay, thanks everyone. Really interesting discussion today. I'm just going to show a couple of slides before we wrap up. Very on topic, our next webinar on November the 15th is all about kickstarting investment in alternative living sectors. So we'll take a deeper dive into some of the asset classes that we've talked about today, as well as build to rent. If you'd like to sign up for that one, then the link is in the chat. We have an event taking place, an in-person event, on the 30th of October as part of our Urban Living Insight series. We've done those recently on build to rent and later living, and this one is all about hotels and hospitality. It'll be hosted by my colleague Eloise, and if you'd like to go to that, you can see more details in the chat. We've also got the LinkedIn profiles of our panelists today in the chat, so if you'd like to carry on the conversation with them there, then please do drop them a line. If you'd like to work with us, Urban Living News, on either our digital or in-person events, then do get in touch with my colleague Henry, who you can see on screen there. His details are there and also in the chat. And finally, thank you everyone. Thanks ever so much to Jonathan, to Catherine, to Oliver and Kelly for their fantastic insights today. Thank you to you for watching. We'll leave the session open for a couple of minutes so you can take some notes. Enjoy the rest of the day. Have a great weekend, everybody, and I'll hopefully see you all again soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Hello, we are International Hospitality Media, or IHM for short. IHM is the #1 brand to engage with decision makers in hospitality and real estate. Our 4 multimedia brands lead their respective sectors with breaking news, comments, trends, and opinions across a variety of multimedia solutions. We provide an inspirational community to connect people through world-class events, webinars, podcasts, award schemes, and much more. But let us share our story of who we are and what we do. Over 10 years ago, Piers and George had a light bulb moment to provide expert opinion, comments, and low-cost digital content. And so, they went on a journey over the past decade, creating media platforms to serve the hospitality and real estate industries. We now have an engaged audience with a reach of over 60,000 monthly visitors across our website, 52,500 in our email database across all sectors, and over 68,000 across our social channels. Everything we do challenges the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. We make things simple and very easy to work with us, and we're a friendly bunch too. We offer creative solutions to help you achieve your business goals. Read, watch, listen, and meet with IHM. Connect with us for a chat today. Just look at some of the brands we have worked with recently.